So I didn't notice he was at your house.
He was, but he wasn't.
He was working for Jeff on, or
Right,
but not
right.
at the dam. Yeah, but he
And then the
might be.
next year,
But
he,
he,
well, so this made him moved up into the administrator role the next year when the merger.
so he might be more willing to do it for the athletic department because it's
Oh,
more.
that'd be even better. There's a lot more
Yeah,
people there.
yeah. To me, that's like a
Yeah.
bigger
Okay.
opportunity.
And yeah, so wants to, I don't know, more just deal with him, or I
Yeah.
can, and then he can deal with me separately or whatever. And I mean, like, I know there's
No, go ahead.
even next year, you know, like,
So yeah, like
A few more minutes.
I came all the way to California.
but like
You came from California.
North Philly on Thursday. You know anyone out there? Like
Rob Aitken. Rob Aitken.
oh, I just told Jared, or not Jared, Mike, my name, and he'd be out of town. He's just relatively close.
Rob Aitken.
Is he? Are you gonna come? Does he want to talk? Please? Okay. Yeah, on Thursday.
Did you reach out to him?
I didn't. I only reached out to the people who had what I thought was kind of close. You might have told me.
Yeah, I missed that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, why don't you reach out to him? And if he says yes, then give my number.
What's the name? What's the date?
Tonight. Yeah. That'd be great. Sit there and talk to him because I already know what you need.
Okay.
Which is fine.
Yeah.
Trying to build a crowd there too.
Yes. How many people are you expecting?
That's what I use in the back. I don't know what skirt I think that's my good one. Like someone that wants to talk, but I don't know. So the mornings are better. Now it's
Like 8:30 at night. Short-term stuff. You know, the short-term. But like the
yeah, that's long. Are you gonna? Did they go to LA? That's not lining stuff up there. San Diego. And then I don't know about LA.
I usually go.
Okay. Hello, and welcome to the Jay's 72nd Annual Detroit Jewish Book Fair. My name is Sue Lutz, and I am a member of the Book Fair Committee. Book Fair is proudly sponsored by the Jay, where you can find your Jewish center. Book Fair would like to thank our Platinum Day sponsors, Alyssa Mertz and Susan Sovel, Bronze Book sponsor, Temple Israel, and sponsors JCC Maccabi Games, and J-Rec for their support. We'd also like to thank Schuler Books, our community bookseller partner for 2023, and extend our gratitude to the entire Book Fair Committee. Your dedication and efforts have made all of this possible. We have a dynamic lineup of fantastic authors and programs that you will not want to miss. Please pick up a Book Fair brochure or visit our website for more information. And all the information is in here, and the website is in here. Please visit our bookstore after this program. Your purchases help to support this annual event and allow us to bring these wonderful authors to our community. And most of our events are free, and your purchases enable us to do that. Thank you. Or you can also visit our online bookshop, and the website for that is in here. Okay, now for today's authors. It is my pleasure to introduce this afternoon's special guests. Mark Snyder spent nearly 20 years, raise your hand, that's Mark, spent nearly 20 years as a professional sports writer in Michigan, working for the Detroit Free Press and the Oakland Press, with much of that time focused on the University of Michigan sports, particularly football. He was named the State of Michigan Sports Writer of the Year in 2011 He lives in the West Bloomfield area. Special guest Eddie Magnus was the senior student manager for the 1997 Michigan football team. He was responsible for overseeing the other managers and was always in the middle of the action by holding Coach Lloyd Carr's headset cords all year. A native of Massachusetts, he now lives in the Ann Arbor area. Following the program, Mr. Snyder will be signing copies of Mountaintop, the inside story of Michigan's 1997 national title climb, just outside the Janice Carrick Gallery. At this time, please silence your cell phones and turn off any devices that light up or make noise. Please join me in welcoming Mark Snyder and Eddie Magnus.
Hey, thank you for that nice introduction. We really appreciate you guys all being here, and I think that that's representative of Michigan fans just in general. You know, there's such a passion for Michigan people that once they kind of get connected with the university, and even people who didn't attend the university, it's something that seems to be like a lifelong bond, right? I mean, it's just kind of a connection that, I mean, we both attended the school, and it's something that just kind of continues. You see things popping up throughout your life, even when you're not talking to Michigan people, right?
Yeah, and for sure, because I ended up in Ann Arbor, and that was not where I thought I'd be growing up in Massachusetts. But after going to school there and then living in Chicago for about 20 years, my wife's family is from Michigan, and I always had a dream to move back to Ann Arbor and raise a family, so that's what we're doing.
And you all remember, I guess, we'll talk about the origins, I guess, of the book. You all remember the 1997 season and how wonderful it was. It was just a magical time for Michigan fans because things had been down a little bit. Back then, they thought 4 losses was a bad season. I think we learned later that there's more perspective on that. But, yeah, it just kind of everything fit. And as you read in the book and as you remember from that year, you know, every break that had to happen, they caught it. Everything worked just the way that, beyond expectations, really, because they were picked 14th to begin the season and everyone had this magical time. But then for the next 25 years, no one, I mean, people, they've tried to live up to that, and they've never won the national championship again. And as Michigan people know, this is the only time they won in the last 75 years. And for a program that's as prestigious and as noteworthy as Michigan, that team has a certain affection with everyone. But what kind of struck us all, struck Lloyd Carr, struck Eddie, John Jansen, who was one of the captains, that no one had ever chronicled that season. No one had ever written a book, which is really surprising because, you know, anytime anything small happens somewhere, it turns into 15 books. And so I guess, Eddie, you want to talk about the origins of kind of how this came to be?
Yeah, I was been fortunate enough to continue my relationship with Coach Carr even after I graduated in 1998. And when I moved back to Ann Arbor, we were spending quite a bit of time together. And he asked me and John Jansen, who was my roommate at Michigan, to go out to lunch. And at that lunch, he said, "Look, I want a book written on the inside story of the 1997 team. Every story that's been written has been from the outside perspective, and no one's been telling the stories that haven't been plastered on the front page, and that's what makes that team so special." So after that lunch, during that lunch, I had mentioned Mark's name as a potential author to do it, and we reached out literally on our drive back from that lunch. And that started the ball rolling. And that was about 2.5 years ago.
Yeah, it was interesting because, for those of you who don't know, I covered the Michigan football team for about 15 years over time for the Detroit Free Press, and that was on my primary beat. And I developed a lot of relationships, including one with, you know, Lloyd Carr over time, and we had a mutual respect and everything. We had a great connection. But what happened was I had gotten out of the business for a number of reasons about 7 years ago. And then all of a sudden my cell phone rang, and it was John Jansen, who was the captain of that team. And John and I had a relationship, but it was just really out of the blue. I hadn't talked to him in a number of years. And I said, you know, "What's up, John?" he's like, "We want you to write a book." I'm like, "I don't do that anymore. You know, this is not a thing." I had actually talked to Lloyd Carr a couple years ago, we had a talk about maybe writing a different book, and it just never went anywhere. So I kind of put that out of my mind. So then John and I went back and forth a little bit, and I kind of made it a circumstance where if I kind of said, to write this book, I had never written a book, but what we would need is the cooperation of everyone involved, and that's kind of the key. And I think that Eddie can talk a little bit about that. Getting the guys and the people involved in the team on board was important.
Yeah, it was an interesting process because it wasn't very linear. And what we tried to do was create a lot of momentum and then build on that momentum. So it first really started with access to Coach Carr. And Mark and Nick and I would spend Sundays or Saturday mornings with Coach in his backyard talking about the team, his ascension to head coach, his philosophies, and then ultimately every week, and this ties to the chapters in the book, a game. And what was the preparation for that game, and how did you approach it? Once we had that was the first few months, we started to reach out to different players. And then once you got a player, like obviously John, I'd have him reach out to Mark Campbell. And then Mark Campbell would then say, oh, well, I got Mark and John are doing this. Do you want to do it? And then we started to build and build. And then it was easier to sell. It was like, hey, everyone's doing this. Do you want your story told? And so it was a cumulative effort. It took almost a year to get everyone on board. We would do Zoom calls, usually starting at 9 at night and some lasting to 11. But it was a great, great process.
Yeah, we spent over 100 hours working with these, with these guys and having them tell stories. And at first, I was very hesitant. I brought Nick. I should mention I brought Nick Baumgartner on, who's another colleague of mine I guess he was a competitor, but a very good friend. When I was at the Free Press, he was at M Live. We both covered the football team. So it's interesting in sports writing. You almost become closer with the people you're competing against than the people who work at your own newspaper because you're on the road with them and you're traveling and everything. So, and I trusted Nick implicitly, and that's what made it really nice because we had different strengths. We knew we could both write, but at the same time, reporting-wise, we had different focuses. Nick is very much a football guy, the procedure, the games. He knows all the plays and everything. And where I was more, the human element and the people element, and kind of, so those things melded together really well, actually, because it was an opportunity for us to bring that season into focus in different ways. And I think, Eddie, you probably saw some of that in the questions we asked and everything.
Yeah, for sure. And Nick was, very focused on, game planning and what was this play in this scenario? What were you thinking when you subbed in this player for that player? And, Mark's focus was really on, the funny stories that were happening behind the scenes. And there are a number of them that are laid out in the book, which I'm sure we'll talk about here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was part of the fun. Like, we kind of had an idea. Not having written a book, I think actually worked to our advantage because we didn't feel that we needed to structure this from the beginning, go into the plan and fit the stories to the plan. We actually got all the stories, we did the reporting, and then we made the book based on the stories we had. I think that we knew that there's, obviously 12 games, and we knew those would be important, but to focus on each game as its own entity, we didn't want to make it about necessarily, some of the games, obviously, you needed to address what happened on the field. The Rose Bowl, Ohio State, Iowa, for those of you guys who remember, those were really key moments in the season. Colorado, the first game to a certain extent, and Penn State. But the humanity of it throughout the process is kind of how we started to put it together.
Yeah, and maybe just diving into one of those situations, how we balanced that. There's a player, Chris Floyd, who was a terrific running back, fullback, selfless player. And he did not play in the Baylor game that season. And I actually, up until this process, still did not know why. He was a senior player. He was good enough to play. He did not dress up. And when we were Zooming with him, he told this story, which was he had, after the previous win, gone out to a party. He had a drink. He was with friends who were really intoxicated. He ended up driving back, getting pulled over, and something that happened back then would not happen today. The police officer said to him, "Well, do you want me to call your coach or do you want to go to jail?" And he said,
He thought about it for a minute.
he thought about it for a minute, and he said, call the coach. And Coach Carr, in the middle of the night at midnight, got up, drove out to pick him up, drove him back to his apartment. And I said to Chris, I said, "Well, what did he say to you in the car?" He just said, "Nothing." And he said it was the scariest drive of my life.
A lot of heavy breathing. Yeah, and I think that's instructive of a number of things. It's instructive of Chris understanding, actually, when he dropped him off and he's getting out of the car, Coach Carr looks at him and says, "You're not stupid enough to leave again tonight, are you?" "No, Coach, no." But actually, it says a lot about Coach Carr, because really, if you understand the hierarchy and the structure of a major college football program like that, that is a thing that usually gets delegated to a small staffer, maybe even as someone like Eddie, at that time. Go pick up the kid, figure it out. I'll see him in the morning in my office. But Lloyd Carr had this relationship with these guys, and he felt it was his job to deal with it, and he dealt with it in the moment. So he went and picked him up himself. And I think the police officer was kind of surprised, from what we understand, by that too, because that's just not the way things really happen. And it says something about Carr and kind of who he is as a man.
Yeah, and Coach, throughout that year, I think, and through his entire career, I mean, it's his humanity, I think, that sticks out. You can, even when he's talking during a game or after a game, the first thing he does is give credit to the other team. The second thing he does is give credit to his players. He never takes the credit. He always takes the blame. And when you're there in the meeting rooms with him, it was much more about, he's looking after you. Like, you got this real belief that he really cares about you and your future. And because of that, the players and the staff were willing to do anything that they possibly could to help him.
And I think that was reflected in the book, because all of these guys and women from the office and all of the people associated with the team, the managers, they wanted to do this for Coach Carr. That's why they wanted to participate in the book. They felt that this was their gift to him, was to participate. And his intent in the writing of the book is the opposite, because he wanted them to have the book to show the future generations. So the fact that that all worked out really made it easier for us to write this first book, because that's the hardest thing of writing a nonfiction book from everyone we've talked to, is getting people to talk to you and being honest. And the fact that I had some relationship with a lot of these guys helped a little bit. That Eddie had a relationship, there was a trust factor from the beginning, and they were willing to be open and tell stories they hadn't told in the 25 years before.
Yeah, and Coach had opportunities to write books about coaching. And his late wife, Lori, told him there have been enough dumb coaching books. We don't need another one. And that put that to bed. But this story is different. This is really about his humanity, his life, and how the players viewed him then and still do to this day.
It was fascinating, because from the beginning, this is something that I had talked to him about a couple of years earlier, that he had these notes, and this is a comment on him. This stuff really happens now more often, but it didn't then. Because he was a teacher, he carried a tape recorder with him at practice, and it became stream of consciousness, where he would just talk into the tape recorder about whatever he was thinking. And most people, these are at practices, because he did it because he wanted to have coaching points to review and then talk to the next day to his staff in their staff meetings. But as it turned out, as he started talking, he's talking about everything under the sun, and you'll see in the book, his mind is pinballing all over the place. But it was really instructive and fascinating, and he had all of these typed out. Staff members would type them out, so he'd have them for the next day. And so he gave them to us, and Nick and I used that as kind of the basis to ask questions and to get into his mind in the moments. And obviously 25 years later, not everyone remembers things, but having a contemporaneous account of what was happening at the time really made a huge difference.
Yeah, and there was definitely some interpretation as to what those notes meant, because if you knew Lloyd's language during practice, some of that stuff was not for the written word. So the staff member who we spoke with, who translated them, gave us the cheat sheet on some of the verbiage, and we were definitely able to get to the main points.
Yeah, and that's part of the book too. Like, we had a decision to make in this, and when Lloyd had talked to us at one point. He was kind of adamant. He wanted it to be a clean book and everything like that. And we kind of said, this football language, we're going to be honest to the way people talk. And when guys were on with us, they were pretty honest and open about with their language. And I think that reflects, it kind of puts you, when you're reading the book, into that place of how they actually felt and what their emotions are. So everyone that we sell one to and I talk to, and they say, well, I'm getting it for my kid. I say, okay, you need to understand this football language in here. And then we kind of work from there.
Yeah, no, for sure. But yeah, Lloyd's recollection of that year and his career leading up to that was certainly made the book a lot more thoughtful. Some of the challenges that he had when he took over the job, certainly managing Coach Moeller's departure at that time under not the greatest of circumstances. And then going into his third year, which was the 97 season, the pressure that he had from the fan base and from the administration, which we weren't aware of.
Absolutely, yeah. He coached, I guess this was the second time he had an ultimatum. He had an ultimatum his first year when he was an interim coach, and they didn't give him the job until the Illinois game. He had to win a certain number of games. And if you remember closely, in that his very first game as a head coach against Virginia in 1995, they had at the time, the greatest comeback in Michigan history, and Mercury Hayes caught this ball in the end zone as time ran out, and got his feet down to win the game. And it was chaos. But Michigan won their first 5 games that year and established him in that role. Had Mercury Hayes been out of bounds, you lose your first game, maybe none of this happens. It's like a little sliding doors thing there, huh?
Yeah, I mean, and he had to win a certain number of his 3 games, and he was on the...
In 1997, the first 3 games.
1995.
95, you're talking about,
Yep.
okay.
And that year we played Purdue in this just slog. Like it was, I've been to probably over 100 plus football games in my life. This was by far the worst weather. And it was 5-0. It was the score. We got a safety and a field goal. We played terrible. And only Lloyd knew going into that if they won that game, his job was in short. So he went to the podium thinking, everyone was disappointed. It was a tough win. We should have won by 30, and he was the happiest,
Absolutely,
coach winner.
absolutely. But we have a great story in the book about the athletic director at the time. His name was Joe Roberson, and he was talking to one of his confidants, someone who worked in the athletic department during the game, and he's watching the game because he had already made the decision, that Lloyd was going to be the permanent coach, and he was going to announce it. And then he's like, what if we lose this game? How's this going to look? And then it all worked out. That I like to mention, too, it's I worked at the Michigan Daily when I was in college, which is a award-winning student newspaper and everything at the school. And that was one of all the years, that was one of my favorite headlines they ever had. It was offense 3, defense 2. So I won the game. I guess we can go on to something that's kind of maybe somewhat contemporaneous here. You all who follow Michigan football understand that the last couple of weeks have been very challenging off the field with the sign-stealing circumstance. In 1997, actually, and this is how Eddie and I met, actually, there was a circumstance where there was sign-stealing actually for the Wolverines, and the Wolverines were the victims that year. Now they're perpetrators, apparently. But they were the victims, and that's kind of a great story, Eddie, if you want to kind of talk about the origins of that.
Yeah, sure. So we were playing Northwestern, and it was actually on Yom Kippur. And for whatever reason, of the 11 managers that year, 5 of us were Jewish. So we had our kind of Sandy Koufax conference. Should we skip, or and we came to the view, for whatever reason, this was more important than the first game of the World Series, so we ended up participating. And as was mentioned, I was holding the cords of Coach Carr during the games, but we also had 2 of our managers who were on the other sideline during the game, and we did that because each football team has their own footballs. And so if a play were to go out of bounds on the other sideline, to get a Michigan ball in, you have 2 ball boys on the other sideline. So the first half of the game happens without consequence, and then we enter the third quarter, and our offense is going nowhere in our first drive, and immediately one of the managers runs over John Datz and says to me, hey, they know our plays. They know our signals. And I should mention, before that game, Tom Brady had his appendix out, and he would have been the dummy quarterback on the sideline giving signals. But because he was out, for whatever reason, we didn't have the foresight to add another quarterback, and so we just had the one quarterback kind of giving the signals, and they weren't that complicated. Anything below the chest was a run, and anything up here was a pass. So it didn't take him very long, apparently, to figure it out. So I say to Coach during the middle of the third quarter, I said, Coach, they know our plays. We need another quarterback. And he got on to Stan Parrish, who was our offensive coordinator, and said, Stan, they know our plays, but in the context of a game, things get lost, and we didn't adjust. And then the next series, it's about like 3rd and 15, and we do a run. And on that situation, you would expect to get 5 yards and punt, and we go -4 because they're yelling run, run from the sideline. So I turned to Coach, and I'm like, Coach, they know our plays. And then he immediately yells at Stan, and then we get 2 other quarterbacks giving the signal, so we have a total of 3 at that point. Only the quarterback knows which one is, quote, live. And then the next drive, they're yelling run, and we're passing, going down the field and passing. And we had ended up winning the game, and for whatever reason, we never really talked about it. Like, it was just part of the game. And
He's being humble, but the managers didn't want to take credit and make it look like they were had a larger role than they actually did, right?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the players make the plays, and we're there for watching. But the funniest part about this story happened 10 years later, where John Datz, who was the individual who ran over to tell me about the stealing of the signals, was a district attorney in Denver, and he was doing a robbery case, and the witness, who was robbed, was getting cold feet. So he went to the person's house, and she wasn't home, but her husband was, and he's sitting down talking to the husband, and they quickly realized that he was the person who was stealing the signals that day on the sideline.
Wow. And we ended up talking to him. Actually, there's a story that Eddie worked with me and wrote in the Free Press, soon after it happened. And kind of, it's really interesting because that was what happened that day, and that's all they knew. But then as we dug into it a little bit with this guy, Dave Hansberg, that he had been doing it the 2 previous years as well. And that was a bit more obvious of a tell with the center and where he put his hand on his leg or put it on the ground or whatever. Run past, but everyone was stunned in 1995 and 1986 that Northwestern upset Michigan. But that's how they did it, is they knew those, but no one knew that for many years, and they kept it quiet. And now I think it's a badge of honor for the managers. It's a badge of honor for Hansberg, who is now an athletic director in college, and it's kind of fun story there.
Yeah, and just a weird note on when I was in Massachusetts, I was a ball boy for the New England Patriots, who were also involved in a Spygate scenario, and I was friendly with the person who did the taping then. So for whatever reason, I'm like intertwined.
You're the
with all
nexus
these
of the
signals.
universe here, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. That's great.
No, this one I'm innocent. I swear.
He's kept his distance, right? Yeah. So I mean, there's so many of those stories, and things came out really that hadn't throughout the whole. I felt, and Eddie, we all felt that we really knew everything that happened. Even John, who was on the team, and then stories kept happening, and then we would dig in a little more, and we were like, wow, there's so many flashpoints throughout those years. Actually, when Nick and I started writing, we were like, okay, we'll have a chapter on each game. And then we really realized that the years before, building this team and all the adversity they had to go through really informed kind of leading up to this whole thing. I mean, we had to all the way go back to 1994, and some of you remember, the miracle at Michigan when Cordell Stewart in Colorado threw that bomb and kind of changed college football history, one of the most famous plays. And so that from that low point and how it built up to this moment was really informed, and really almost half the book, I think, is the lead up to the season.
Yeah, and one of the lead-ups, which was a catalyst for, I think, how close that team became, was another ridiculously random story, which was two roommates in South Quad, Steve Frazier and Aaron Shea, decided to throw a party in their dorm on the 5th floor, which was probably not the best place to start. But Frazier, who was a center, is about 6'4", 290 pounds. His son is now going to be at Michigan playing offensive line as well. I wonder if his son will do this, took a keg from the storefront and carried it. I said, how did you get it to the 5th floor? Because you couldn't have used the elevators. He's like, I had to carry it up 12 flights. So they have the party in their dorm. Everyone leaves after midnight, including Aaron and Steve. And the next morning, Steve gets a call from another player saying, hey, I think your dorm's on fire. And sure enough, he comes out and he's looking at South Quad and he's counting. He's like, yeah, that's my dorm. He had a sofa, an electric sofa that another player had given him that for whatever random reason that day caught fire. And so the Michigan Daily, doing their good work, decided to take a picture of the burnt dorm. And in the middle of that picture was a burnt keg. And then it got back to Coach Carr that room belonged to Frazier and Shea, and they had to get him down to the building where very early in the morning, where Lloyd absolutely, in his scariest form, told them they were teetering on being on this team, that they would need to come to the Michigan Stadium at 6 a.m. for the next month and run the steps. And if they missed any day, they would no longer be on the team. And as he walked the room, Jansen went into the room and Coach said, those are the two unluckiest son of bitches I've ever met.
Absolutely. And they all showed up, though. They did show up, and actually at one point it almost backfired on Carr because the guys who were big guys, they lost so much weight over that time from the excessive going up and down the stairs that it became kind of a unique dynamic that he's like, okay, we had enough, and he had to kind of make up some reason about why they were done.
Yeah, but he also made sure that it wasn't just Coach Carr, it wasn't just those two players, it was also seniors on that team would also need to come down and monitor, and the seniors would rotate. And every morning they would meet with Coach Carr and walk around the stadium and have life conversations. They weren't really about football, but they were just about Coach Carr getting to know these players in an intimate way, while Steve and Aaron were running up and down the stadium. And there's a lot of reflection on, when you talk to the seniors who had the privilege to do that, on what that meant to them and how that kind of shaped their approach to the 97 season.
Absolutely. And I think that that's one of the bonds here with this team that's unique. I mean, people ask about all the other teams and why they didn't win. I think that there was something special about that group, and I think Eddie, having been a part of 4 teams, could probably speak to that, about the difference and the unity. I mean, they had a leadership group of only 5 guys who were fifth-year seniors, and those guys became so tight, but they were also so humble. They didn't want all the attention, and Brian Greasy's a perfect example of that. He was one of those guys, and he became the Rose Bowl MVP, but it was never about him. He was never wanted to be the star necessarily. He wanted to win, and that's kind of what happened, and that kind of trickled down. That set the tone for the team, and that's kind of why that team maybe is more unique and more bonded than any other.
Yeah, it was interesting because when we started the process, it was trying to pinpoint, well, why this team? Why this year? What made this so special? Michigan has had great players before. They've had great players since. And what it really comes down to is this just bond between the players really playing for themselves. And there's good examples in the book about players who excelled in the NFL, were willing to take a different role for this team, even though it probably on paper would have hurt their chances to get stats and to make themselves more viable for their kind of next career. but everybody on that team bought in. It started, as Mark mentioned, with the seniors, but they really took on the personality of Coach Carr, and we bought what he was selling, and he was right. He said, if you make these sacrifices, and these leaders are doing it, so you in the back, you freshmen, you have nothing to complain about, then we're going to go places like the Mountaintop, which you'll never reach again.
And that's interesting. That's a great segue to the name of the book, and the title is The Mountaintop, because what happened was before the season, there was a lot of things that happened that were really unique that year. The coaches were sent on the Alumni Association offered a trip to Alaska for the alumni, and they invited the coaches to come, and the coaches could go for free with their families, but obviously a little interaction with while they're on the ship and everything like that. So Carr, being a former teacher, was always a big avid reader, still is, and his daughter Melissa had given him this book, Into Thin Air by John Krakauer. I don't know if many of you have heard of it. And so he threw it in his bag, and he went. And while they're on the cruise, his wife Lori got sick. She got seasick, and so being the dutiful husband, he sat in the room with her while she was sick. And so he, not getting to experience the ship, he read the book, and he loved the book so much that every year he had a theme, but he felt this was the proper theme for this year because he read it, and the book is really about tragedy and about the people who were on the mission, climbed Mount Everest, and died because they went when it was inclement weather. They went further than they were supposed to. They didn't turn around. But Carr saw it from a different perspective. He was wondering about the people who left the group and did come back, and one of those actually lived in Michigan. His name was Lou Kasicki, and so Carr, being, again, the humble man that he is, he wanted to reach out to Kasicki. So instead of calling his operations director, Scott Draper, and saying, go find the number, I said, well, how did you get his number? He said, I called information. So he calls information, and he gets the number, and then he calls up Lou Kasicki, and he says, I'd like to know more about this. So he calls him up, and he says, hello, is this Lou Kasicki? He says, yes, this is. He says, hi, my name is Lloyd Carr. I'm the coach of the Michigan football team. And Lou says, everyone knows who you are. Thank you very much. And so they talked a little bit, went back and forth a little, and then Lou eventually came in and talked to the team. And first the team's kind of rolling. I don't know, were you in the meeting? Yeah. Guys are all rolling their eyes. Another speaker telling us about how great his accomplishment was or whatever. But as he talked, the thing about Lou is he had gone and promised his wife before he left that he's going to follow the rules, and there's a turnaround time. And if things are bad, you turn around at a certain point, you're coming home. You're not going to get to the summit, but you come home. And he made that decision. He came back. He's been with his family for all these years, and because of that, Carr, that's the part of the story that resonated with Carr, the guy who was part of the team, but also understood about following the rules and staying within, working with themselves. And then you can take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's even before that, the way that really translated into our season was, if you're familiar with the book or anything about climbing Mount Everest, is you start acclimating yourself, right? You start with a base camp. You don't show up like the first day and try and climb the mountain. And that was really what Coach tried to instill in all of us, starting with showing up in the summer, which is, okay, we're in base camp right here. And then there's different levels, and he would equate different parts of the season with the actual climbing of Everest. And we even had a graphic, which was Mount Everest, and then each game that we had to play as we got higher and higher and higher. So that was certainly like the commitment to preparation was a big part of that. And then as Lou, and I was fortunate enough to be in on all the speakers that came through Michigan through the 4 years there. No one had quite the attention of the players like Lou. And at the end of his story and the questions, he was about 300 feet from the summit when he turned around. Everyone on the team got their own maize and blue pickaxe. And we all got a pickaxe, and we all hung it up right in the front of the meeting room. So every time we went into the meeting room, we saw that pickaxe. And Lloyd would often read an excerpt from that book, which he was prone to do, or a poem in other instances. But And so the whole story was woven around this concept of climbing the mountain. And he'd say, if you get to the mountaintop, then you'll have experienced something that is a mountaintop experience. Like, you just can't equate it to anything else. So, and that turned out to be true.
And that kind of defined a lot of these guys. I mean, we would Zoom with these guys. That's how we did the majority of the interviews. We did a couple in person, but majority of them. And we'd say, yeah, what was that? Do you remember when he spoke to you? And they'd say, hold on. Then they'd go in the other room and they'd hold up that pickaxe. 25 years later, every one of them still has it. So it really is a unique moment. It's a unique thing about this team. And then I think after that, things started, other teams kind of picked up on some of these things and they've done these gimmicks. But one part of that's actually a funny story and very on brand for Carr is all these schools have these huge budgets and they would farm these out to design companies to create whatever they wanted or whatever. Carr had a buddy, and his name's Tom Wozniak. We spoke to him. He did them in his garage. And I got pictures of all these things hanging, like, in his garage. He gave me these pictures, and they're hanging down, like, and he painted them by hand. And his wife was like, "What are you doing?" All this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and one season was the bricks, which were a brick. The other one was like hold the rope, and the rope was like this big. So when we got the pickaxe, it felt a little more special.
Yeah. So it's really a unique book. I think there's a lot of different things that happened in there, a lot of experiences that resonated with these guys forever. And this is a part of their life that really is so meaningful, but no matter what they've gone on in their life, all of the guys, even when we're talking to Charles Woodson, who's in the NFL Hall of Fame, and Steve Hutchinson, who's in the NFL Hall of Fame, these are the moments that were formative for them and made them into the people and the players they are. Successfully, obviously, in football, and Charles Woodson's a successful businessman. And we haven't really talked about Tom Brady much, but Tom Brady, obviously, he had talked about Carr and he considered transferring, but he stuck it out and he became the Michigan quarterback, and that launched him into something greater too.
Yeah, and Woodson and Brady, they're both significant philanthropists as well, and that Absolutely. Is something
and
that
Brian Greasy and Hutchinson also.
Yeah, and that is something that really stems. In addition to, I'm sure, what they've experienced, but with Lloyd, when Lloyd got the head coaching job and signed his longer-term contract, the first thing that he did was set up a scholarship for women athletes at University of Michigan. And part of the program at Michigan was to go to Mott's, their children's hospital, and visit with the patients. And if you look what Charles Woodson is doing today, it's supporting Mott's in a very significant way.
He has an endowment there, yeah. Actually, Carr's connection, many of you know the story of him and his grandson later, who passed away from childhood brain cancer. But even before that, he had a connection to Mott. He was the lead fundraiser when they built him and Dave Brandon, who later became the athletic director, and was a regent at the time. They led the campaign to build the new Mott Children's Hospital, which is recognized as one of the great children's hospitals in the world. And they had been a part of that in the fundraising. He had this connection. He did his mother Lloyd Carr's mother had passed away the summer before 97 season, the summer of 1997, and he still obviously had this crazy focus to be able to coach this team. But that informed a lot of things. He did this car wash for kids, and he had his players out there washing the cars and raising for charity, and just cancer charities became important to him even then.
Yeah, and those are lessons that we all took with us to this day.
Yeah, it's rather remarkable. Eddie's on the board of the Chad Tuff Foundation, and so I guess this is probably a good time. We've talked for a long time. Do we have time for questions?
We have time for questions.
Okay,
so
great.
If you can just, if you have a question, you can just ask us, ask them,
Sure.
and just please repeat the question.
Sure,
because
absolutely. Yeah, Linda.
Was it difficult to find a publisher, or did you have a publisher before you started writing?
No, we did not have a publisher before we started writing. We learned a lot, having never written a book before. Nick and I learned a lot about the publishing industry and just kind of how that works. And through a couple different conversations, we kind of, and the two of us talking, we decided that the best process was self-publishing. and then we kind of own the books that way, and then we can make decisions going forward about that.
Yeah, and I think that actually made it a better book because we were able to work on the timeline of the players, which, you know, was like herding cats at some point. And so the fact that Mark and Nick were gainfully employed and weren't just trying to having this be their sole source of income gave us the flexibility we needed to really go deep.
Howie?
Mark, you mentioned that Lloyd Carr was a teacher. What's his background? You know, his ascension to.
Well, I guess he began, he grew up in Riverview, Michigan, where we'll be tomorrow night if you all want to come and hear us again. Yeah, he grew up in Riverview, and he had moved there from Tennessee when he was about 8 years old, and he became a great athlete in Riverview, and he went to Missouri as a quarterback and followed some of other great athletes from his town, and he was very successful. He transferred to Northern Michigan, led them to an undefeated regular season, and then decided he didn't want to play professional football. So he became a coach, and he got into coaching, and he worked his way, you know, through the different ranks and everything. And then he was an assistant coach, and I think that for a long time, he came to Michigan in 1980. He had worked for Gary Moeller at Illinois when Gary Moeller was the head coach in the late 70s. That didn't work out for Moeller, but then Moeller helped. And actually, it's interesting too, the defensive coordinator at Michigan at the time was named Bill McCartney. So he was looking for someone to replace Jack Harbaugh, and Jack Harbaugh had left to go become the defensive coordinator at Stanford. There's a lot of webs here, a lot of ties. It all comes back around eventually. And so Lloyd Carr was hired as the secondary coach to replace Jack Harbaugh, and he was just an assistant coach there for 15 years, under Bo and then under Mo, and he was Mo's best friend and best man, and Lloyd's second, and Mo was the best man at Lloyd's second wedding, which was in 1994, right before all this happened, and they had this great bond, and Lloyd, you know, just kind of felt this was something that was his calling, and if he was going to be an assistant coach forever, he was going to be an assistant coach forever, and that's part of the humility, right?
Yeah, and his relationship with Moeller was incredibly strong. And when Moeller left or was fired, you know, Lloyd had this incredible balancing act, and to you know, care about his friend who he loved, but also focus on what was in the best interest of the players and getting the ship righted. And so, while he gets all the credit for '97. I would make the argument his best coaching job may have actually been 1995.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Did you talk with Adrian Taylor?
Yes, we talked to Adrian. I'm sorry, that was loud. We talked to Adrian Taylor. Adrian Taylor, the story for you, those of you who don't know, it's actually the first chapter in the whole book because it was so impactful. Adrian Taylor was a defensive back from Texas on the Michigan team, and in the Penn State game, you know, he had been challenged by his teammates to be more aggressive because the Penn State game was so important. It was the turning point of the season, top five, you know, two teams going against each other. And it was early in the game, and Taylor had been challenged, and he dove and made this tackle on this tight end, and it was maybe the loudest hit that anyone in the stadium had ever heard.
Yeah, and the background of that is the Penn State running back name at the time was Curtis Enos. And one of our defensive backs, Marcus Ray, had played against him in high school. And he said to his defensive back group, hey, look, if you hit this guy high, he'll crack. In other words, he'll give up. He doesn't like to be hit. He's super talented, but he doesn't like to be hit. So we're making a pact. Everyone needs to hit him high. No one's hitting him low. So in the first quarter of that game, he's running, and Adrian dives for his feet. Curtis eludes him, runs for about 14 yards. They end up holding him. They come to the sideline, and the Marcus Ray is screaming at Adrian Taylor and at the defensive coordinator and the defensive backs coach to get him out of the game because he broke the pact. The defensive coordinator, Jim Herman, decided, you know, I'm the coach, puts him back out there. And on this particular play, Adrian had the opportunity to simply push the player out of bounds. And instead, because what had just transpired on the sideline, he turned himself into a missile and hit the player so hard that neither player ever played football again.
Yeah, and so everyone was concerned about Dadrian because, he was a little off and he didn't play anymore in the game. But he took him in the back and he was checked out at the hospital, and they didn't see anything too severe. But he flew back, and then he saw the doctors at Michigan, and actually they found a little gap in his spine, and they don't know if it was there before or if it was because of that hit. But basically, they said to him, "You're never going to be able to play in the NFL. You'll never pass the physical." And so Dadrian and they put him in a halo, one of those medical halos, and he came back, and all the players on the team were stunned because they didn't think it was that bad. And then when they saw him that day, it was a shock.
Yeah, I mean, Charles Woodson tells the story of it being one of the toughest moments of his life when he went and visited Dadrian in the hospital. And
He considered giving up football.
Yep.
Carlos. Yeah, and they were very close. So Dadrian, was really an impactful guy. And talking to him, he's gone on and lived a great life, and he's got a family, he's got a job in Texas. He's doing great, and he doesn't look back and say, "What if?" He thinks that this was just meant to be. But it really was obviously a seminal moment for that team and what those guys remember. Any other questions? Oh, Arnie.
Yeah, Mark, was there any discussion about how they felt about having to share the national championship with the rest?
Eddie, you want to talk about it as someone who had to deal with that?
Yeah, I think, in the moment it's raw, for sure. We asked every single player that as part of the process. And there were some really great stories actually that came out of it about both teams went to the White House at the same time.
That was an ego thing on Bill Clinton's part because he thought he could make peace.
And he was wrong. And one player in particular, Glenn Steele, has still some very strong feelings.
Absolutely. Actually, when Glenn and I went to lunch to do the interview with this, and we're in this, like Leo's corner, and we're in a small booth. I couldn't believe Glenn fit in the booth. But we're sitting there talking. We had a great conversation. He's like upbeat and remembering all these things and sentimental and everything. And then I brought up the controversy with his whole everything changed, his whole face changed and everything. And then I mentioned Scott Frost, who was the quarterback, and kind of incited the whole thing because he had rallied people to vote for Nebraska, et cetera. And I really believe if Frost had walked in that restaurant at that time, Glenn would have taken him out. By all means, yeah, ask us and reach out and everything.
Now, or as Mark is signing his book, and you'll want to get the book for yourselves, for your
Please.
for your grandchildren that go to University of Michigan, and purchase a book, and they'll be happy to sign and have conversations with you.
Absolutely. And I want to just say my family's here and I appreciate their support. Thank you.